The Biden-Harris administration has been anything but passive in their push for transgender procedures on minors. I mean, this is really, as I've described before, I describe it as demonic. It is. It is confusing these kids. It is leading them down a path of destruction. Well, in this term of the Supreme Court, they're going to consider the Biden-Harris administration's challenge to a Tennessee law that bans these procedures and this mutilation of children. Now, you'll recall we've talked about this many times. We were part of putting together the very first one in Arkansas. Now over 24 states have these laws. Many of them have been challenged. This one is going all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, accordingly, because we've been invested in this, the Family Research Council filed a brief this week in support of the Tennessee legislation, which highlighted the glaring lack of evidence behind the standards the Biden-Harris administration has cited to support these permanent experimental procedures from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. Joining me now to discuss this brief is Christopher Mills. He's a principal at Spero Law and a former clerk for Justice Thomas. He worked with FRC to write and file this brief. Christopher, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me.
So first, kind of give us a timeline. What is a brief? Why are these filed with the court in advance of oral arguments? How does that work? Just explain that for our viewers and listeners.
Sure. So before the Supreme Court hears a case, each side gets to file briefs. So the Biden administration filed its brief a few months ago, and then all the outside groups, friends of the court, filed amicus briefs supporting the Biden administration a couple months ago as well. And then just in the last couple of weeks, the state of Tennessee defending their law, and all the friends of the court on Tennessee's side, including the Family Research Council, and many other groups filed amicus briefs sort of elaborating and expanding on Tennessee's defense of the law.
Now, Christopher, you clerked for Justice Thomas. How does that work? I mean, does this actually play a role in the process? Do the justices and their clerks look at these briefs?
Definitely. These briefs are important because the main parties, the Biden administration, the state of Tennessee, only have a limited number of pages and a limited number of words. And especially in cases like this, there's a lot of complicated moving parts. So you've not only got complicated legal arguments about the Constitution, what equal protection means, how that applies in the context of gender issues, and then also all these factual, medical, scientific questions about treatments for gender dysphoria itself. And so there's a lot of room to cover that can't be done just by the parties.
All right, so Christopher, walk us through the amicus brief that you worked on for the Family Research Council and filed.
Sure. So the cornerstone of the Biden administration's argument in this case is that every major American medical association agrees that minors should be subjected to gender transition, chemical interventions, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then, though they don't like to talk about this, surgeries to transition their gender. So the emphasis is on the consensus of American medical groups, and the brief we filed says, let's take a closer look at that consensus. Why does that consensus depart from what the rest of the world is doing? The United Kingdom just did a massive review and stopped puberty blockers for minors because the evidence just wasn't there. Scotland just stopped puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones because the evidence wasn't there. But the American medical groups have done totally the opposite. They've said, we don't really care what the evidence is. And so our brief tries to expose that. Early on in that early Arkansas case you talked about, the American medical groups, WPATH, the AAP, the AMA, came in and said there's a robust body of empirical evidence supporting these interventions in kids. And that's just not true. And we called them out on it, and they deleted it from their brief. And they didn't say that to the Supreme Court. Now they basically say, trust us, we're the experts. And we go through both historical examples of why it might not be a good idea to trust anything that, quote, medical experts have to say, whether you want to look at eugenics or smoking or opioids. And then we go through the specific studies in this area. and exposed how weak it is. And it's not surprising. I mean, these are very new interventions, and they're really dangerous. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will, for many children, lead to permanent sterility, permanent changes in their body. And we're asking kids at ages 9, 10, and 11 to make these life-altering decisions, even while at the same time the AAP says that kids that age shouldn't be able to consent to a tattoo. And so I think the ideological capture of the American medical groups is really what our brief tries to focus on. When they speak on this issue, it is not based on evidence, it is based on ideology.
And it's been revealed that WPATH guidelines were crafted not to promote the health of their patients, but to ensure reliable insurance coverage and defend that windfall in cash flow from legal challenges. Did it not?
That's exactly right. And repeatedly, those internal emails have showed that WPATH was not focused on the evidence. Their own scientific reviews from Johns Hopkins said, hey, we're really not finding much good evidence to go on here. But things like, are we going to be able to characterize this as medically necessary so that we can get insurance coverage? Can we give cover to physicians who are already doing these treatments so they don't get sued for malpractice? And, how can we write these standards so that we can win cases like the one before the Supreme Court? So in other words, they were thinking about practically everything except the scientific evidence. And who gets harmed from that is kids.
Yeah, what happened to the Hippocratic?
Who are mentally vulnerable. Yeah.
What happened to the Hippocratic Oath? I guess it kind of went out the window. Christopher Mills, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for working on that brief and getting that before the court for us.
Of course. Good to be with you.